Welcome to Uncertain Things. I'm Adam, and here is Mike Pesca joining me, host, creator, dreamer of The Gist, and any other titles that I should be throwing at you?
Dream architect. Yeah, I breathed it into being. I looked upon the world and I said, this shall be. I also have a Substack called Pesca Profundities. I'm thinking of changing the name now. What do you think?
Too punny? Too alliterative?
Someone said this is the sort of thing. It's the sort of thing that you'd name that a clever kid who writes a high school newspaper column would name it. I was like, that was the name of my high school. No, it wasn't, but could have been.
It's the bookends of life. It is either a high school student or a retiree writing for their local Connecticut newspaper.
Yes, about these library closures.
See people in the home talking about, did you read the latest profundities?
I don't know where this guy gets his stuff. Where it was all the talk of mahjong. I don't know why I've turned everyone vaguely Jewish or specifically Jewish.
Everything leads back to it. It's a big drain. Before we talk about the Jews, I do want to ask you, and I warned you I will, I want to ask you as a businessman, as an entrepreneur of sound, and innovator of media, give me your survey now of the landscape in the world. Actually, maybe we take a step back. What world do you see yourself in? Do you see yourself as a podcaster? Do you see yourself as a news adjacent reporter?
Yes, I know what the answer would be if this were one of those business podcasts and I was looking to get clipped onto a social media feed. I'd say you have to be everything. That's the old way of thinking, that you can only be one thing. And yeah, it's true. Here's the deal. I think of podcasting as radio, just kind of on-demand radio. I think it's as if you were in a band and you're like, no, I don't make albums for wax anymore. I make them for cassette, or I make them for CDs, or I make them for Spotify. I don't think a good musician thinks like that. So I think of it as radio, and sometimes the radio becomes available in podcast form. But now, radio, podcasting, insufficient. Everything is video. Spotify has tried to tell us that turn all your radio shows into videos. We're doing a video here. Doesn't work on Spotify. But the thing is, and what it's trying to address is that when it was radio, there was a radio that you could put on, and it had, 30 stations on each part of the dial. And that alone would get you listened to. People would say, what's on the radio? So I'm getting at the issue of discoverability. And there is no discoverability in audio. People do not share audio clips. And that's for good or bad, but for growing an audience, it's bad. Discoverability can only happen through video. So this is why we do video. Weirdly, a lot of people just kind of use their video as a podcast. They say the number one podcast player is actually YouTube, and they're not using it in a different way other than everyone else watching videos, but people will, especially younger people, will watch videos in the background and count it as a podcast.
It feels like those words don't mean anything anymore. It's just formats of people talking, right?
Yes. It's all content. It's all information on the information superhighway.
So I'm not. This is not a business podcast, but I do have the occasional navel-gazy curiosity about how people in my pathetic little world of news, academic curiosities, reporting, and audio
That's
come
not
together.
Pathetic. That's not little. That's neither pathetic nor little.
I do have to confess, though, that the only reason that I'm doing a podcast, and I think maybe listeners know this, it's pretty clear considering how much I have, how little respect I have for the medium as a whole. I got into it. My colleague, partner Vanessa, who is now on maternity leave, but usually co-hosts this podcast with me. She was a devotee of audio. She literally wrote the book about podcasting. That was one of her big academic works for Columbia Journalism School. She studied the history of podcasts. That was never my interest. I love doing reporting and talking to people and then writing it down. And then I just realized that the writing it down part and turning it into an article where you also refine the eloquence of the people that you interview and pull out the nuggets, that's a lot of work. And interviewing people and publishing it is a lot easier. So I think I got into podcasting by being lazy.
Well, there's a certain kind of podcast that does that. Let's put it all up and let it all hang out. Then there's the, bespoke, exquisitely crafted audio podcasts of Serial, and those are great.
No, that's true.
Yeah, economically speaking, they used to be podcasts. You'd think of podcasts and maybe you wouldn't think of anything, and then you'd think of Serial, and then I think you started thinking about the Daily. But those are, or at least people in a certain world would think about the Daily. Those are still staffs of 20-something people and hours, hundreds of person hours put into every minute of radio. Then there's other shows that it's not like Megyn Kelly or Ben Shapiro don't have a staff, but that's more like an old radio show. You talk into a microphone, maybe you film it. Here's the big difference to tell how exquisite every piece of audio is. In the world I come from, the NPR world, the following would just drive people. I mean, you couldn't do it, which is something that Ben and Megan do every day. Oh yeah, let's go to SOT 4. It's that. It's signaling the producer in real time. Yeah, let's play clip 3. And the thing is, there's this whole discussion in the world of public radio but also, really highly produced podcasting. How do we make the economics work? Why is no one listening to the extent that we can monetize them? Because no one cares. No one cares about, I don't know, some people care. And in a certain world, you don't want the world broken up if you're doing a documentary with, hey, let's turn to clip 4. But by and large, people just want to hear clip 4. They don't necessarily have to hear the smooth transitions getting into clip 4. And I think a lot of the people in the public radio world or the documentary world of podcasting mistake the demands of the audience, the aesthetic demands of the audience, because we're really talking about aesthetics. We're not talking about a difference of information, Megan and Ben being more conservative than most of the public media. So I think you can lose a lot of the bespoke kind of finely tuned portions of public radio-esque podcasting without actually losing much and saving some production budget along the way.
If we're shifting a little bit to the question of content, the content of content, substance, how do you feel about our information environment right now? I mean, it's a big question considering that even if we're just limiting ourselves to the United States, we're talking about how 300 million people are consuming information. But surely you have some thoughts about how people absorb information and sift through bullshit.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. It's pretty degraded. One of the things that's most annoying to me is that the vast majority of people who will agree with me will then say, and it is because of something like misinformation and disinformation. I think way too much emphasis has been placed on people actively trying to lie to you. And I don't think that's what's going on. I think people have different opinions. Some of that's going on. But is it so much more than has always ever been thus? I think first of all, misinformation and disinformation, it's one of those pairings like Medicare and Medicaid, where they're totally different things. Misinformation is just something that's wrong, happens all the time. We're going to talk for an hour or so, and we'll transmit to each other probably 2 or 3 bits of misinformation. Disinformation is totally different. I think that was overblown. There was attempts at disinformation, but the last election, or the election 2 elections ago, so much got blamed on that, and it became this boogeyman, this shibboleth, and all of that. But
you're talking about 2016 and
yeah, the whole idea of if we only had better hygiene in our information spaces, we'd be better informed. I don't think that's true.
If we had the firewall to prevent Putin's fire hose of bullshit from entering our
if we had the systems within Facebook Meta, all our platforms to call out and to suss out the disinformation, misinformation, things would be better. impractical, and I don't think that diagnoses the problem. I think that technology allows all these voices to be heard, and then all these voices are not exactly heard, but there's a cacophony, and it becomes more audience driven, and the audience doesn't always know what it wants to hear, and it doesn't know
what does become more audience driven.
Everything about our information space is fractured and siloed. And so 30 years ago, when there was broadcasting and newspapers that strode communities like behemoths, those newspapers knew that they were kind of writing for everyone. And as such, there was an incentive to be accurate, because if you were inaccurate, a large percentage of your readership or listenership would notice and object. But these days, since everything is fractured, you could be inaccurate or only portray one side of the issue, and you're really only going for a narrow slice of the audience. So to take a newspaper, it used to be that you had a lot of, take a left-leaning newspaper now, Philadelphia Inquirer. They knew that they had many readers within their coverage area that were going to object, not just if you told them something that they didn't agree with, but if you misrepresented facts, right? And you'd have advertisers who objected to that, and you were hiring, the whole world was different and we weren't as polarized, but you were hiring a bunch of people who didn't come up being ideologically driven in the first place. Now all those incentives have fallen away. So you could basically just tell one side of the story. That's fine. The Philadelphia Inquirer doesn't realistically aspire to be a newspaper for all people. And hopefully it works out with your third of the audience that is more or less where you are ideologically. And it's even truer for podcasts. So I think I think we're in a pretty bad place. We don't have totally accurate or sufficiently accurate gatekeepers. Bad information gets out there, and you just want your fellow citizen to have some sort of basis of reality, some sort of shared reality. And I don't think we have enough of that. And I know that there are going to be a whole bunch of people who are ideological or trying to convince you of something, but I would like it for some sort of referee or the self-appointed fact checkers or the big legacy institutions to still really take seriously. I can't be wrong on this. If I call something fact-checking, the facts have to be right. And I don't see that going on. I see ideology having inflected so many portions of media.
So I of course, heard that the story being told as we have lost the centralization of media, and as a result, and the result of that, and the fracturing, what's the phrase? The disbundling or unbundling of products. All of that together, all those processes together lead to the loss of any kind of central authority to sift through truth, and the loss of the incentives to even do so. But don't you feel like we're also going through something a little deeper than that, some actual epistemic change in our priorities? Because I don't know if I can even really point to many people in our fields that seem to really prioritize a sense of accuracy above anything else. And that comes not just from the changes in incentives. The changes in incentives perhaps highlighted and galvanize it, but you'll be hard-pressed to name 10 people with prominent spots that seem to truly care about holding their own quality of reporting to a higher standard and are not swept by whatever delusion their side might have at a single moment.
Oh, I disagree with that. I think that there are a lot of people who really, really want to be accurate. And I think Sulzberger of the New York Times wants to. He wants to be seen as accurate, but he also wants to be accurate. He's operating within a system like anyone. He has a constituency, right? He has a lot of people who write for him who are maybe further to the left than he would like them to be publicly. But he has pulled the newspaper back. He knows that the whole trend of rejecting objectivity wasn't good for the credibility of his newspaper. He wrote about this in and CJR. He can't go straight ahead and say, no, objectivity is what we do. The phrase, I mean, we engage in these word wars. The phrase has been degraded, but essentially that's what he's saying. We need to get back to objectivity. Many of your listeners will say, he hasn't done it. Yeah, we're always going to criticize the New York Times. I just had an article in the Daily Speaking out on the Free Press today. Very, very critical of a piece of New York Times coverage about a police shooting. But at the same time, they've also hired writers and thinkers who are corrective to that sort of thing. So I think the New York Times essentially wants to do it. I think some of the retired people at the Washington Post and some of the people still there want to do it. Jeffrey Goldberg's in the news today. I mean, I know people on the right will slam him, but I really think he wants to be accurate. He carried himself pretty heroically in this whole Signal situation. I think that we could go through some of the big newspapers, some of the even big networks, and they do. There are many people who really do want to be accurate.
And you think that the driving motivator there is an ethical belief in accuracy, in putting aside the word objectivity, just in being factual and...
Yeah, I think the New York Times... Yeah, I was just talking to an editor at the New York Times, and I know that he and his colleagues talk all the time about being accurate. It's accurate within a world which the best among them will recognize comes from, a certain milieu, and the assumptions are not that, abortion is bad. The assumptions are not that abortion is bad. The assumptions are not that, tariffs are good. There are certain assumptions based on where they come from and what they all believe. But yeah, they do want to be accurate. Many of them do. Most of them do. I mean, there is a debate, right? Wasn't there a debate within journalism whether to go with what was called the moral clarity journalism, the jettisoning of objectivity, versus no, let's keep on doing, call it something else if you will, but objectivity has its place. The fact that there was a debate about that tells you that there's more than 10 people who believe in accuracy, objectivity, that moral clarity, that kind of journalism will get us into a bad place.
So put aside my false minion of 10.
The false minion, yeah.
I might be misreading vibes, but I don't think that the Lowy argument, which was the journalist who wrote, was it? I don't remember who he wrote it about against objectivity, and then the whole.
Yeah. He wrote an op-ed for the New York Times.
For the Times.
They also profiled him. Masha Gessen wrote a big profile of him that set that along in the New Yorker. And then he was brought in to sort of remake the Philadelphia Inquirer in the wake of, huge scandals like an editor saying buildings matter too and being fired after the Black Lives Matter protest took hold.
Right. And then A.G. Salzberger, the publisher, responded to this. We actually interviewed him about his piece at the Dispatch. That conversation has its own internal self-satisfied, almost academic quality to it. But the truth is that the consumers are not interested in. It seems to me really in any kind of that high-minded self-standard towards accuracy, and even in such a lofty organization as the New York Times, and I say actually lofty more in the sense of their reach, and they're being able to still being held accountable to a wider audience, the way you're imagining the publishing houses of yore. They have probably the biggest reach and therefore the most diverse audience. I just going through some of the reactions in their own comment sections and then in the conversation outside of this. It doesn't seem like again, I shouldn't say anybody, I shouldn't exaggerate, but it seems like very few people are there to put money for that kind of internal struggling. I know that the people who pay for the Dispatch are almost entirely there for the sort of self-criticism and nuance, and when they hear the whiff or experience just a touch of heat from a take, they are turned off. But those are people who have been literally trained, and our audience, I'm afraid to say, does not quite meet the New York Times or the Daily Wire's numbers. I do think that the majority of people who are willing to actually pay for news want some kind of righteous indignation on one side or the other at the expense of accuracy.
Yeah, it's probably true that for the majority of news consumers, or at that point, are they even news consumers, opinion consumers? But there are plenty of counterexamples. The Dispatch, it's probably true that Dispatch readers, if you serve them just a bunch of things that challenge their worldview going in wouldn't like it. Who does? I have this conception that there is a certain kind of person, and I'm one of them, who does like being challenged, but I don't like being challenged 75% of the time, right? And even if there is an outlet that will challenge me 75% of the time, I have to mix that into my news diet kind of gingerly. So that's one thing. But I think the Dispatch is a good example. There's this other news service that Isaac Saul has started called Tangle News. Do you know it? So it's great. Isaac writes up, here's 5 views from the left, here's 5 views from the right, and here's my view. And he really, he's like a monk. He tries to take himself and the ego out of it. He'll give you his opinion, but he really tries to be unbelievably fair. And they've just hired hey, look, this isn't going to blow you away and it's not going to make the New York Times jealous, but they've just hired their 7th or 8th staffer, and they make in the low single digits of millions of dollars in revenue. So this to me, and the Dispatch is doing well, this to me shows that there is an appetite for it. It's also strange when I read the New York Times comments section, a lot of the articles that go against what you would think would be the stereotypical critique of the New York Times as a left-leaning rag. I think specifically on the transgender issue, there would be so many comments saying if there's an article that is just a good journalistic article, and they have done them on what WPATH or some of these other organizations that are rethinking or at least thinking critically about gender identity in youth. So many people will say, thank you, this is sensible, this is what I need, I'm trying to navigate this and get to the truth. Now look, people will say that about the very ideologically inflected places too. Pick a place that we're like, all right, we know where they stand, be it the Daily Wire or the Intercept. You'll get a bunch of comments saying, thank you for telling the truth. Everyone defines the truth that way. But as I see the willing to be challenged and know that my truth isn't the only truth, as I see that as a niche, I think that there is possible and demonstrable money to be made there. I think that there's a big enough market for that.
So let's assume that your optimism is justified, or that it's not optimism, that you're just seeing things clearly. How does this help us? The reality is that you alluded to the Signal story, and maybe you can unpack it to our listeners. I know that a lot of the Uncertain Things listeners are not necessarily so news obsessed, so they sometimes come here for more esoteric discussions of I don't know, Tom Holland. I think I have a good hold on the Tom Holland fan club in my listenership. So they don't necessarily have read the news today. So maybe give them a rundown on this, and then let me ask you a question about news as it pertains to this.
We're speaking on Tuesday. Is today Tuesday? I never know the day. Yeah. So I don't know. Is this going to air today, tomorrow?
Probably tomorrow.
This is going to be, I predict it's going to be ubiquitous. But Jeffrey Goldberg was invited to a Signal chat.
Jeffrey Goldberg, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic.
Editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, a journalist who didn't ask for this, gets a Signal invite on the app Signal, which is an encrypted app from Mike Waltz, who's the national security advisor. He doesn't really know Waltz. He joins this group, and the group winds up being a principals committee that is discussing what turns out to be the strike on the Houthis that the United States took on March 16th. And for a long time, Goldberg says, I thought I was involved in some sort of operation where they're fishing for my information, because that happens a lot. But then it turns out to be real. He's privy and reports on the internal discussions of Pete Hegseth, J.D. Vance, other people debating and discussing what's going to happen. It does happen exactly as they say it's going to happen, thus confirming that he was in the group. And then Goldberg is very responsible and doesn't give away undercover identities of CIA operatives, doesn't give away details of the mission that couldn't peril anyone. What's interesting to me is two things. One, Democrats are making hay of this. Hay should be made. Was this is this a violation of the law? Possibly. Could be. Certainly a violation of regulations. Certainly unsafe. Certainly incautious. All those questions should be made. I appreciated the insight that I got of how the deliberations occurred, where you saw J.D. Vance in private and with a group of 18 people he thought were, high cabinet officials and such, kind of behaving like he does not in private, where he raises what he thinks are the most important issues, which are, let's not do this to help the Europeans. Europe benefits more from the shipping of the Suez Canal. This is why they hit the Houthis, because the Houthis were striking at ships in the Suez Canal. This is something that will help Europe more than it will help us, and I don't want to help Europe. The other members of the channel were like, well, even though you're right, JD, of course, we all hate Europe. We should hit the Houthis because President Trump said hit the Houthis. And then, and this dynamic is fascinating, Stephen Miller, advisor, who titularly or on the org chart, certainly in the aren't as high as he is, certainly aren't in line to be president. But he comes in and said, no, I heard the president say he wants to hit the Houthis. Boys, we're hitting the Houthis. And hit were the Houthis. The Houthis were hit. So that's all really interesting. Another interesting aspect is Hegseth said, you're right, JD. No one really knows who the Houthis are. So how we have to sell this is, one, Biden was weak, and two, they're backed by Iran. And I remember on my show, on The Gist, I played a bunch of clips, and one was Mike Walls saying, they're backed by Iran, and Biden was feckless. And then I played a clip of Hegseth going on Fox News with Maria Bartiromo saying, the reason we did this was shipping lanes and freedom, but also Biden was weak, and they're backed by Iran. So it was really interesting to see the difference between the private and the public. I shouldn't have been able to see it, but that's the lesson and the gate of the Signalgate, as they're sometimes calling it.
So educationally, that's super interesting. But I want to ask you, bring it back to the question of our information environment. Even if we have some kind of establishment that still cares about factuality, and in this case, a lot of these establishments, be it the New York Times eminently or the Dispatch, clearly this is within our wheelhouse of attention. What good does it do? Because in response to this revelation, it seems that the reaction split primarily into the obvious two. One, from the Democratic side, like you said, like they were making hay of this and saying that this might be an impeachable crime. Whereas the right immediately turned into, well, the great thing about it, as you said yourself, Mike, see how coherent J.D. Vance is between his outside persona and inside persona. The real scandal would have been if he had been proved to be a fraud and internally he actually says, like, I really worry about European economy and we need to protect our allies. That would have been a revelation. But the truth is that all you've exposed is the great integrity of these people. And who knows, maybe it was actually intentional that they allowed this to come out in order to share how much they care about their public.
Almost no chance of that. To interrupt, right? They gave away when the bombing was going to happen.
I'm saying the message. That's the line.
I think it's of great value.
It's insane. It's insane.
Yeah.
Like, let's be clear. This is an insanity. And I'm talking about this sanguinely because I think that the moment that I saw the debate between Trump and Biden, I just entered a euphoric limbo of liminal state of something between joy and horror, just realizing that this is where we are and this is where things are going to go. And you have a president who can't complete sentences fighting against a president that tried to steal the American democracy in the middle of brewing war, civilizational war, be it with Iran or with China or with Russia. And I'm like, okay, this is where we are. I'm just going to enjoy the ride from now on because, whatever I knew until now is basically over. So all I can do is take some distant amusement of the events. So my description of the story is trying to capture how the right describes it, not to diminish what a normal liberal democracy, how a normal liberal democracy or the old American national security hawks should respond to hearing the fact that a journalist was accidentally introduced into the top secret conversations about a military operation or a security operation in a different country. But the point is that an informational ecosystem does not allow for this to really seem like a scandal to the people who don't want it to be. And there is no factuality, accuracy, or reporting, literally showing hard facts about the incompetence of an administration will not convince the majority of Trump voters to vote otherwise or to even reconsider their vote.
Yeah, I don't think it's as desperate as you're painting it out to be. First of all, I think the majority of Trump voters is not the threshold or the criteria for a worth, or if anyone changes their mind, or if an important number of people change their mind. I think there's great value to getting a glimpse into the private deliberations of very important people. I think that there's great value in
as a historical perspective. Absolutely, as a fan of history, I love that we have that on the record to understand this administration better. As a matter of policy and the quality of the society that we live in, I'm not sure.
No, I think it is, because let's say we get through these next 3 years, 8 months, and J.D. Vance there's no third Trump term, and J.D. Vance gets the nomination. This will go far into answering the question, does J.D. Vance just say this anti-European, America first, pro-isolationist type stuff? Does he just say it because it sells, because Peter Thiel likes it? Like, does he really say it in private? Like, now that we know how the guy acts in private, we get a greater glimpse as to what his convictions are. I would have liked to have gotten such a glimpse. I mean, if it is true that Trump pulls off his tariffs, and if there was a way to figure out that Trump would privately concede to people, look, I'm going to try to do what I can, but in a couple months, if the stock market's down, I'll be pulling back my tariffs. That would be of great value to us as voters, as interested news consumers, as people trying to understand the real motivations of our leaders. This goes really far to explain the motivations of our leaders. And I don't think that we could judge it based on it either works or it doesn't work if immediately there are consequences and heads will roll. It adds to the accretion of actual information about the most important things the government is doing. And unlike, I think the things that I and you despair about are just the amount of nonsense priced into the system. So unlike some scandal about Joe Biden's auto pen, which we, waste time on, or let's take a scandal that's maybe a little more plausible, or a scandal or a subject that we spend a lot of time on that really doesn't hold up to scrutiny. I don't know, one of the claims about why the Venezuelans were taken to El Salvador, right? I think this is very substantive. So this is, to me, as far as the information ecosystem, this is a good moment.
Maybe. To me, I think...
How would you define it as a good moment if something happens as a result?
So I think the thing that's bugging me is that and I think that's why, to me, the breaking point was the debate, but it was already included into it was the October 8th riots and the discourse around it and the nihilism of MAGA. And I think at bottom, what really...
Wait, do you mean January 6th? What were the October...
No. To me, it's just... I'm throwing in just a bunch of...
What's the October 8th riots?
The pro-Hamas riots in America.
Okay.
And to me, the reason I'm bringing all of these threads together is that, and again, this is a bit of a vibe discussion, but I think that the image that I'm getting about our current political atmosphere is nihilistic. October 8th is nihilistic, and I think January 6th, for that matter, is nihilistic. I think MAGA as a power cult is nihilistic, and I think the left as a utopian fantasy cult is, at bottom, actually really nihilistic. There is no overcoming nihilism, and that's the thing that really gets to me. And that's where, when you see scandals like this, where in a normal society that has its feet on the ground, I feel like it would actually cause an earthquake. And I don't feel that way, not from the right, but even not from the left. I don't buy the outrage on the left anymore based on the past several years. My hunch is that if something similar would have happened during the Biden administration before he had been pushed out of the race, it would have been excused and the cover-up will be as massive. I don't know that there is a society in America right now that actually cares about anything. And that terrifies me.
Yeah, the worst arguments of the most partisan people are certainly enough to make you despair, especially the fact that these are not a tiny fringe. It's massive. You're right. I mean, there's a lot to despair about the fact that there is so many people willing to make the worst arguments over everything. And I think you're right. If it was a Biden screw up, it's not like heads would roll the next day either. And you're also probably right that I'm moving the goalposts a little bit. And I say, well, in this environment, the best you can hope for is maybe first the Democrats get mad, then they do some polling, then they see if it resonates with the public, and then maybe Mike Waltz gets fired. But that was really because he was crosswise with the Steve Bannon faction anyway. I mean, so you're right. I don't say that that's a great shot against the idea of nihilism. But I also think that, change is possible. I think that elections come only every couple of years. I think give people the chance to vote for something sensible. Maybe they will. Was it nihilistic that Trump beat Kamala Harris, or was it nihilistic that both of those were the candidates that ran? And is it nihilism that created that, or is it our polarization and really bad structure of how we do primaries and how the parties have such a hold on the kind of people that they pick?
I mean, the nihilism could be emergent, but it's there, right? The nihilism might not be the original, the great explainer, but the nihilism is now the result. The nihilists might explain their burn it all view because we live in the uniparty and it's time to break it down, or because we are controlled by the Zionists and everything to bring them down. But there is just a growing sense of nothing matterism. And that is terrifying. And I don't know that is something that is rectified by a better election. Like, I don't think that the election result is the problem. To me, like, Trump getting elected, great, fine. I don't think that neither option was particularly exciting, but
yeah, I think we're more or less agreeing on that the big scandal was who the only two choices that we had. Look, I think that there was a moment after January 6th, when there was a vote in the Senate and the House, and many senators changed their vote, that would be an argument against nihilism. That something mattered. That this was so shocking that they were not going to say, let us decertify the election. Many House members did not. Everything that played out in the years since then that emphasized, you can no longer take that stance and be a member of the Republican Party, that would argue for nihilism. But let's take October 8th and Israel.
But let's stay on the January 6th thing, because I think I don't think it proves the point you think it does. Mm-hmm. The fact that you had people who were willing to basically undermine the American democracy and were just suddenly shocked by a riot at their doorstep to get them to change their mind about, maybe let's not undermine American democracy quite yet. That's not a good sign. That's not great that it's only the people with the clubs and the pitchforks coming to you makes you rethink whether or not you should decertify the election, right? That's already a bad sign.
Well, I just want to make sure that we're not using a term that has such a capacious definition that it always fits the phenomenon we're talking about.
Sure.
To me, there was this illogical and ill-founded claim that the election should not be certified. It's disturbing that many members of the Republican Party were ready to buy into that claim. But if nothing mattered, then the January 6th event wouldn't have mattered. But it turns out, at least in that moment, it mattered. And then there was an impeachment, and the impeachment didn't go forward. 10 members of the House of Representatives voted to impeach Trump, who were Republican. They'd all have to leave or be, attacked and thwarted by Trump. So everything since then, since that moment where we could say, okay, something matters a little bit, something's getting through in half of the country that was once playing with fire and not living up to truth and their responsibilities. Okay, then they weren't based on an exogenous event. But then after a while, it turns out that it was clear that you'd have to believe in this fiction. So yes, we're more or less agreeing that since then, more nihilism, more nothing matters has been injected into the body politic. But, it's not everywhere. It's not equal with both parties. I think that there's a chance that the fever breaks. I also think that if you look at America's reaction to Israel and the war in Gaza, it's more heartening than much of Europe. And, most Americans, not young Americans for a lot of reasons that are cultural, most Americans, don't care that much about foreign affairs, but are behind Israel and are more or less picking the right side of this conflict that they don't think affects them much. And of course, all human beings see pictures of kids who are crying or people with bombs on them who didn't deserve it, and they feel bad, but they're still in favor of Israel. So that, that's different that's a rebuttal to the protest of October 8th. You can't let too big, but a small portion of the society define the society.
I hope your assessment is correct. What is your to switch topics?
That was politic, yes.
Yeah, I mean,
diplomatic.
No, but it's not. I don't have certainty either, right? As I keep saying, I'm reading the vibe tea leaves. So it's just every event like this just brings out the wow. It really feels like nothing matters to people. But just to pull back a thread from before, the reason that this came to me after the debate is because the absurdity of seeing the Trump-Biden debate really showed the nihilism on the left. The democratic machine talking about the importance of fighting this real threat to democracy, putting a completely incomprehensible president that they have been touting is at his best shape. That's talk about cover-ups. It was insane, and it was insane because it was a lie that everybody knew was a lie, and somehow they we're just going to go with it. It's going to we'll see what happens, because reality doesn't really matter until sometimes, rarely it does. But anyway, so October 8th. How was October 8th for you? I don't think Israel was ever a major topic for on your radar.
Yeah, no, it was definitely on my radar. And so my radar and my output are different. I would follow a lot of news about Israel and had strong opinions. It wasn't always the best thing to talk about on my show because I think I probably talked about the protests over judicial reform a little bit. And in general, I would talk about Israeli elections, and how they affected the United States and the Abraham Accords. But it just wasn't a good topic because here's what I have to do as a talk show host. I have to meet the audience where they are, but also I get to define the terms. So I like to listen to talk shows or podcasts where I am more or less at the same level. I am sufficiently read in, but not so read in that they can't tell me anything interesting. So it's, some shows will really define things down, and some shows are really filled with expertise. I don't mind going along with those expert shows. I listened to a show called War on the Rocks about, different kinds of strikes in Ukraine, and 2/3 of the terminology they use when I started listening, I didn't know, but then I oriented myself. But anyway, when it comes to Israel, I just felt like I probably knew a little more than the audience, and it wasn't really that terribly interesting or worth it to me to try to orient them. So I didn't talk about it that much. There's a lot of other things to talk about. And then soon after October 7th, I was invited to go on a fact-finding mission, and we talked to a friend of mine who has deep roots in Israel, brought a few of us along, and there was one journalist, me, and one member of academia from Vanderbilt University. And we met with generals, we met with former head of the Shin Bet, we went to Kibbutz Be'eri, and that informed me a lot. It was something of a junket. I was on the schedule that was programmed, but I asked whatever I could. I learned a lot. And then I came back and I did a live one-man show about it. And I've been talking about it a lot ever since. if I didn't go, I'd still be talking a lot about it, but that definitely made me smarter.
You're basically the Ta-Nehisi Coates of the pro-Israel side, is what you're saying.
I went once, and then I remembered an argument I had with Jeffrey Goldberg years ago. Yeah.
What was it about that moment that made it more important for you to talk about?
Oh, well, I mean, for the obvious reasons that this was a horrible terrorist attack against a big American ally. And then there are the interesting and intractable questions about how to solve this problem. But I also, without even meaning to, so much of what I do is press criticism, and the reporting on it was just not up to my standards so often. So I felt I could do the audience a service by pointing out a lot of the narratives that were misleading or wrong. I did many shows on the whole idea that Gaza was a large outdoor prison.
Open air prison.
Huh?
Open air prison.
Open air prison. Just not true. Most open air prisons do not offer horseback riding on the beach or theme parks or aquatic parks or malls of that quality. I would not want to be a Gazan who could not escape Gaza, but it was not a large outdoor prison. And there were many facts, especially those on the far left, that would go unrebutted. A big piece that I did, and a big problem that I had was the rape rebuttal, which to me couldn't be more horrific. It exposed the people making it as hypocrites. There was, like, I used the phrase word wars before. There was all this semantic chicanery going on where people who wanted to deny that there was any rapes would use the phrase mass rapes, and they try to deny that there was mass rapes, even though there is no agreed upon definition. All I know, and I do know this, is that many Israeli women were raped on October 7th by members of Hamas or those acting in concert with Hamas. And to deny that is, to engage in just kind of the worst calumny. But the people who are doing it think of themselves as some of the best people in the most progressive portions of America. So I talked about that a lot on my show.
It was a instructive moment when my boss, my signer of checks, Jonah Goldberg, wrote a piece for the LA Times about October 7th, and he mentioned in passing a Hamas attack, blah, 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 raped, blah, blah, blah. And a colleague of I don't know if colleague is the right word, but somebody else who gets paid by the LA Times commented and said, like, the rapes have not been proven, and they have slapped correction. And this is in a time where...
And by the way, they took out the phrase from Jonah's column, and they made him change it to a less accurate version of what happened. I asked Jonah about that when he was on my show, and yeah, there was a in-house rape denier, I guess, in the LA Times who thought the best thing that he could do is go on social media and say, actually, they haven't proved any rapes, which they had.
And so to tie this all back to the theme of broader cultural nihilism, which I don't think nihilism is the original cause, because clearly here there is a lot of political motivation, and there's a lot of confluence of voices. Some of them are truly anti-Western Islamism. Some of them is anti-Western leftism. Some of them is bored, over-educated, and underinformed early 20s students who are searching for meaning. But the result of it is the erosion of any kind of value system, of any kind of ethical theory about truth, let alone any kind of commitment to the liberal world order, right? Like, let's even not go as far as an idealistic as talking about the liberal world order and worrying about our fellow democratic allies, right? Which nobody cares about in truth. But this is the sort of collapse into nihilism that I'm talking about. There was no accountability from the LA Times afterwards. There was no apology sent to Jonah. There was no, let alone to, a declaration of apologies to the families of women who've been raped and murdered, right? To just be a newspaper that says, like, we're going to just like airbrush this line about rape. I don't know what to do with this.
Maybe it'll make you happy to know that the LA Times has basically fallen apart since then. I mean, the process was underway. The entropy had set in. Yeah.
But to ask you, so you were driven to covering this conflict, say, mostly from the media criticism perspective? Was it just seeing how poorly conversed this issue is on the papers of our media, or was it something else? Did it awaken?
No. That's one thing I could do, and that's one thing I could definitely add. I tried to get pretty well versed, and I had a lot of military people on. Now, is this media criticism? There was an idea that Hamas can't be beaten in a war, that Hamas is an idea and an ideology. So I did a lot of segments on my show about rebutting that. There have been many ideologies that have been defeated. Prominent example in World War II, we faced off against a group called the Nazis, and then the Nazis were defeated. I guess some smartass will say they're back now. No, not with all the guns and the uniforms out loud and controlling a whole country. So many, many examples of homegrown terrorist units who were defeated. And it is not true that if you kill one terrorist or one ideologically impassioned freedom fighter, you'll create two in his stead. If it were true, all the world would ever have is just terrorists. Terrorists would always win because they are the Hydra. But that's not the case. So I talked about military history. I talked about how it happens and talked about some military tactics. Yeah, I talked enough about Israeli history, a little bit about the idea of Zionism, which is, that's also mistaken and misapplied. I guess, talking to you, I am driven mostly by, I'll read something, I say, well, that's not true. I won't just have that gut reaction. I'll try to talk to someone or do some research or try to demonstrate why that is not true. And sometimes, by the way, it is true. And
I was just going to ask.
Yeah, I've done many segments that do not reflect well on Israel. Guess why? Israel's a country, and countries make mistakes, and countries also have terrible people within them. And if you're a democracy and you give the people the reins or the right to the ballot, they're going to make a bunch of bad decisions, which happen in democracy, and they're going to oppress some people. I'm also fascinated by conundra. So what can you do? How do you react if you're a country against constant attack? You probably have to attack the attack. And that does, foment people being upset with you and wanting to attack you more. So it's also very interesting.
Do you have any outsiders' advice to Israel right now? And I feel...
Yes, they want my advice, yes.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, this is a conversation about big picture and thoughts and vibes, and this is more about sharing the sort of inner monologue that you're having, one media voice to another. Like I'm actually wondering, what is, when you're reporting on this and you're trying to be as journalistic about the coverage as possible, but surely internally sometimes you're screaming like, why just do this? Do this. What is that? What does that voice scream inside?
More beeper attacks? No, I don't know. I don't do that, actually. I do that sometimes in the U.S. context. I'm a little humble in trying to tell Daniel Hagari or any of these Israeli public information officers what they're doing wrong, although friends of mine always say they're not communicating correctly or effectively. So if I had maybe one piece of advice, it's when talking to the U.S. audience, just constantly analogize it to a U.S. experience. And that's where I had a pretty pro-Palestinian guest who writes for the Washington Post on the show. And I just said to him, which isn't a new idea, but if we were in Livonia, Michigan, and hundreds of militant Canadians streamed over the border and killed thousands of people in Michigan, the things we do to the enclave of those Canadians are probably pretty similar to the things that Israel is doing to Gaza. And he disagreed. I'd like to think we wouldn't. I'm like, well, not only do I think we would, I think most people listening to this would like to think we would. I mean, it's tough to think about the Canadians. If you want to take it to San Diego and Tijuana, sure, go ahead. But I think the citizens of most countries want to live in a country where they are defended from attack. And even if the attackers have some motive that is understandable, you still want to be freed and safe from being slaughtered. en masse. So these are analogies I think that when talking to a U.S. audience, Israel should make. And I think Netanyahu does that to some extent. He emphasizes democracy. I don't like his definition of democracy. I don't always agree with it, but it is a democracy, And so like Israel...
I mean, his definition of democracy just now includes impeaching judges or completely overhauling the judiciary, as he just commiserated with Trump about his frustration of having some of his policy declared unconstitutional.
Right. So this is a good analogy. Like when people say, people in the United States, maybe left-leaning people will criticize Netanyahu for being undemocratic. True, but they also criticize Trump for being undemocratic. Also true. So to what extent does that open you and your family up to getting killed by terrorists who point to the undemocratic nature of the leader? Like at that point you would say, well, I don't deserve to be killed.
Although if we take the phrase literally and they're talking about the democracy in itself, in this sense, they are more democratic. Not wanting to have the voice of the majority be impeded by such proceduralism as a judicial review seems to be very democratic.
So if Democrat
spoken,
if Democrat only means the will of the people, but when we say liberal democracy, we mean that the structure has a constitutional basis, which Israel doesn't have, but it often means protecting the minority. And
that's why I'm very much in the camp that I think we've discussed it in the past, but I'm on the liberal camp, not on the necessary. Like liberal is the emphasis. Democracy is what's the phrase? I forgot the name of the sociologist who coined that, but that the democracy and liberalism are married, but it's a marriage of convenience.
I like that.
Yeah, I'm from the liberal side of the family, but. It's just, this is just in Israel that this conversation about the judicial overhaul, you said that you did one piece about this. I don't know who you spoke to. You didn't speak with Habib Gur by any chance about it.
No, I don't think so. But I hung out with him a couple weeks ago and he has an invitation to come on the show and the guy's a genius. Has he been on?
Yes, I interviewed him about the overhaul back when. And I think this is one of the interesting problems of that discussion, especially when we go to Israel, because the people who were fighting against Netanyahu at the time were saying that he is trying to hijack democracy. And Netanyahu could very legitimately claim that actually he is reclaiming democracy. He is bringing back the majority rule to a system that has been mostly hijacked by philosopher kings in the form of the judiciary. But this is absolutely true. The problem is that the things that he is eliding, of course, is the fact that there is no underlying constitution, which means that this is forevermore just a power struggle between the executive and the judiciary. Now, the thing that's a little terrifying right now in this analogy is that it seems like Elon Musk and Donald Trump are now replicating the same kind of judicial overall rhetoric in the US. My guess is that this is actually just the Viktor Orban playbook that has reached both Israel and the US. But in Israel, at least it makes sense in lieu of a constitution. The U.S. does have a constitution that clearly delineates the separate responsibilities and the division of powers, which means that what Elon Musk and Donald Trump are saying is a lot more blatantly a power grab. And that's a little uncomfortable to go back to how we started this, that Netanyahu, in trying to appeal to an American experience, is trying to flirt with the power grabbers of the American democracy. Liberal.
Right. Well, if you're Musk or Trump and that's your side of the argument, that's the case you're going to make. You're kind of forced to. And I don't think in the U.S. context, it's a good case. I don't think it'll go far. I think that 8 years ago through last night, the idea of norms was probably overplayed and overly pointed to. But there are some norms, and the people of the United States respect the Constitution. I mean, that's usually a pretty good trump card, no pun intended, when you could pull out the Constitution, so it doesn't say it there. Take, for instance, the idea of birthright citizenship. I don't know how much most people have really thought about it and said good or bad. If we had to start from scratch, would we do that? A lot of other countries that are very progressive and our allies don't do that. But it was really, once again, no pun intended, trump card. Say it's right there in the Constitution, people. And except for the most dedicated partisans who've thought about it a lot and don't like it, the vast majority of people said, yeah, it is in there in the Constitution. So what I'm saying is, in the United States, with the Constitution, not only does it exist, it's not an asterisk, it's not a fusty old document, it's a pretty popular document. It is a pretty unifying document. Maybe it's a counterexample to nihilism. The United States, most Americans do believe in the Constitution. So I think that Trump and Musk are going to lose this one. And another argument they make is always the unelected judges. What are you, Elon? And also, doesn't most people that Trump criticizes, aren't they elected? I don't think being elected or not elected is determinative of worth. And I think even Donald Trump knows that. It's just one of those words. If it's available to you, you use it as a cudgel.
You know, I just realized what's happening. We are playing out the prologue to the book of Job.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
God and the devil arguing about Job's soul and whether or not I don't think the metaphor of soul quite exists in the Hebrew Bible, but whether or not he is a true servant of the Lord. And I clearly am the devil, Satan, making the case that no, trick him and he will abandon the Constitution without a blink. So even your idea that Americans love the Constitution, I feel, is already being belied increasingly by the past couple of years, where the way that even, surely the public who doesn't even, for the most part, hasn't had to read a single amendment, but even, august sense-making institutions like the academia are being very loose in how they understand the Constitution when it serves them. And, just 3 years ago, we went through the journey of court packing, and both reimagining.
Totally constitutional, by the way. Ill-advised, but constitutional.
No. Right. But part of the debate about the idea of court packing was what exactly is supposed to be the role of the judiciary in the system, and whether or not that could be and how can be overridden. Also, impeaching judges, totally constitutional, ill-advised, but constitutional, right? But you can see that the loosening of the norms around the Constitution is already opening up more and more pathways to disillusioning the meaning, the value of the Constitution in the first place. And I'm not even bringing up the hot button topics like, I don't know if they're hot anymore, but free speech, because I don't think anybody believes in free speech anymore. But the First Amendment and the First and Second Amendments, which used to be the core focus of constitutional debate, now we have gotten all the way down to the 14th. So I feel like we're evolving in our desire to disentangle and deconstruct the Constitution. I just
That's
don't believe.
That's a good line. I like that. we need to stop at the 6th, though, right? I'm not so convinced that this is a Constitution-loving people as you do. I think by habit, maybe. Yeah, well, I mean, how much can you expect? People aren't constitutional scholars. They respect the Constitution. They've also have strong opinions about the Supreme Court, and they want the justices that will rule in their favor, and they don't want the justices that will rule against them. And so you could say, since the justices are there to interpret the Constitution, you can't really want certain kinds of justices if you're purely pro-constitutional. But of course, that's the way that the court works, and one's opinion of the court works. I don't know. I'm worried, Adam, that you're looking through the world through an overly nihilistic lens.
I mean,
I don't know if you've been black-pilled, but I think you look at everything. You're looking at so many things.
I've been sad-pilled. I've just been sad-pilled.
Yeah.
I mean, the bottom line, just put it this way. Like, the argument is, without using phrases like nihilism, when it comes down to it, will most Americans prefer to defend the system, the American constitutional liberal system, or to have their team win? This is what it comes down to. A critical threshold of them will. And the choice won't be their team winning versus that. The choice will be something like, if Donald Trump keeps losing in the courts and he does defy court orders, will there be more people upset with that than they are over the issue that he's defying the court over, that he's defying the court order about, right? So let's say someone likes what Donald Trump is doing or whatever percentage of America likes what Trump is doing with Venezuelan immigrants. And then this judge said, no, I've looked at all the
I looked at all the case law, and even if they were on planes before 7:03 p.m., they're still under my my purview. You, sir, violated the Constitution. Then we need these remedies. And right now, it looks like Trump is more or less agreeing with it, or at least not openly defying the court order. But let's say he defies a court order. Take the polling on what percentage of Americans like the Venezuelan deportation policy. Will it be the same number as like him defying the court order? No, a lot of people weren't that informed about it. Those were opinions loosely held. Maybe they just would tell you right now, yeah, but if it comes to the Supreme Court, we're going to rule with this. We're going to go with the Supreme Court. So yeah, I think there'll be a lot of breaking away of however popular he is if we come to that actual bona fide crisis, not this pre-crisis we're told we're in.
Perpetual.
That's what I think. You don't.
No, I mean, I don't know. I'm just, like I said, getting bad vibes. I hope this is just my.
But the thing is, people support policies and outcomes that work for them, and at a certain point, they don't like the fact that immigration set records under Biden, and we had 11 million immigrants, and it was 0.6% of the population. They don't like that. They want that to stop. They more or less like Trump's immigration policies, but they also like what works for them. And if they perceive everyone going crazy, we're now not going to have courts. We're not going to have rule of law. I think that they'll say to themselves, this is too chaotic. This no longer works for me. And that's where I think the Democrats have to go. Just elect, only think about policies, and here's why it works for you. And this is how it works for you. And this is how, Jared Polis, he's governor of Colorado. He essentially talks about everything he does. He says, and this is going to make you this much richer. And here's why I support this tax cut, or here's why I don't support this level of spending. Just talk about how these things practically are going to work for you. And that's the opposite of their stance on transgenderism. It's their I think I'm not allowed to use that phrase, the transgender issue. It's their opposite on the Democrats' opposite on their stance on the police and policing. I think if one party gets more identified with policies and ideas that will work for people, including not tearing up the courts and throwing it away, that party will be popular.
That is that's the thought that carries me to sleep actually nowadays it's mostly just schadenfreude, but in the past that's the thought that used to carry me to sleep, which I see as the faith in the American normie to care more about their own simple material embetterment about any kind of ideological. That's the best. This is
why have a democracy. If that weren't the driving characteristic, there'd be no point to this.
No, I mean, truly, in the deepest sense, right? The whole idea of a liberal, pluralistic society is that we can all play our philosophical games of either theological or ideological, culture war, but we're not going to kill each other for it, and we all agree that we're just better off, kind of just having free commerce and free exchange, and we'll play culture war sports, but we'll ultimately just live better together as a society with the shared litany of rights. Fantastic. I am in love with the American normie. That's why I moved here. I moved here for the American normie. I wanted to get out of a society that is completely defined by its political, by its politics. Let me ask you. How long have you been doing this? Not this interview, which has been like 4 hours, but how long have you been in your wearing the hat of a journalist?
Oh, I've since about 1995.
Okay, so you've seen a few phases.
Yeah, and I've rocked them all.
Which rocking left the biggest impression of you? Which kind of the social cultural transition really blew your mind?
Yeah, I could understand everything, but then the Great Awakening threw me out of a job, essentially. And I just think that it was a moment. It was a short moment, and you could say the pendulum swung. But getting back to, how does this work? How does this work for people? I think at one point, the Me Too movement worked for people. Good. Finally, we're getting Bill Cosby, Harvey Weinstein, etc. And then it really stopped working for people. And I think maybe you could argue there was some necessary correction. in terms of policing or race. I don't know what exactly those things were. I'm not saying they didn't exist. Someone could articulate, yeah, before the Great Awakening, we were bad on this specific issue of as related to race. I don't know, a phrase we used or something that we now regard as a microaggression really was a microaggression, and without the movement we wouldn't have known it. Fine. But then it really began not working for people, and it was surprising. It was surprising for so long, and I really feel it was dictated by elite culture, a lot of the colleges and stuff you were talking about, and it cast a pall on journalism and just the truth-seeking industries and a lot of society.
Why was that? Why did that blow your mind? I mean, it did blow up your career for that moment. But why was it psychologically a shock for you? Unless it was just primarily losing your job, that you didn't expect that to be a possibility.
No, because the truth was, for all the pendulum swinging and all the vagaries of sentiment and things that were trendy and not trendy, we always did get back to more or less sensibility, or they were very impassioned. The Tea Party was impassioned, and there were other mass movements before the Tea Party. These passionate movements, but eventually the passions cooled because how the world worked best for people reasserted itself. And it probably has something to do with social media, like our definition of the world stopped being the kind of media, a lot of our interactions are intermediated by media. So once social media gained a lot of influence, our definition of reality changed a bit more so than it did with, from radio to podcasting or some other technological changes. And so it was surprising to me.
Right, that's the epistemic shock that I'm thinking about.
It was surprising to me that this moment of obvious excess wasn't seen as such until way too late, until it stopped working for so many people, until there was a lot of destruction.
I'm trying to get more into your personal view of this, because just for listeners who don't know the drama, it was you were fired from Slate because you raised concerns about the
essentially fired. Yeah.
You were phased out of Slate.
Slate and I stopped getting along.
Amicable divorce. Divorce. You got to get from Slate after you slacked about, was it Donald McNeil?
Yeah.
It was
he was in hot water with the New York Times for using a slur in private conversations with a student, not as a slur, but just to seek clarity on an issue. And then cut to ripples, and years later, the whole New York media world opining that this guy's got to go or this guy doesn't. I was of the opinion that maybe this guy doesn't, and people didn't want to hear that opinion. So
and that was enough to create enough acrimony for you to feel like you have to leave. And just to tie it back to our business conversation before, I think it's remarkable that you were able to leave with your toys, which I think is not obvious. I don't know how much time and years of your lives you had to spend to get that deal in place.
Yeah. Almost a year.
And the point is, that clearly is the moment that you're describing as being of some kind of a shakening for you in terms of just like.
I mean, I saw it before it happened to me. I was shaking my head saying, what are we doing?
No. I mean, but that moment leading up to that, clearly, I mean, I suppose that part of the reason that you felt then compelled to bring this conversation up and was because you were feeling that the conversation is going a little bit haywire, and you were trying to push back against it, not because you were trying to promote and legitimate normalize use of the
I was trying
N-word,
to push
right?
back against a haywire conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
I am wondering, how does it feel from your perspective as you're recognizing that there is a discontinuity in how you understand the balance of I don't know, power, the intellectual balance of power around those years? How does it feel like subjectively for you when you're starting to notice? Where are you starting to see the changes? Where are you starting to recognize that the world is not as it has been in 1996?
Oh, wait. So you're saying in the year 2020, when did I start recognizing it?
Yeah. And how does it feel like if you can describe that moment of feeling, that internal shattering, that tectonic plates are moving?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it was the 10th, 100th, or 50th person who lost a job or was, quote, dragged online for kind of ridiculous reasons. I don't know if it was the 10th or 90th time that I had to whisper to someone about one of a couple, then 3, then 12 topics that you couldn't really have a full conversation about, or massive conversations about deplatforming, when I was always of the opinion that you want to hear, even from people you don't agree with, or just the changing of what is the default setting about free speech. I always said you meet bad speech with good speech. You counter speech with arguments. Oh no, that couldn't happen. Like all these people who weren't necessarily my closest colleagues, but people in media or the sense-making organizations, however you want to say it, who just stopped making sense, to quote David Byrne, right? Who started articulating what I thought were clearly the wrong arguments on the wrong side of issues like speech and debate and how we get to an actual consensus, or just the idea of objectivity and embracing the idea of let's do journalism with the right outcomes and a definition of good and bad people in mind. I'm like, how are we doing this for 30 years? 25 years. There are standard definitions. And now the standard definitions are being tossed overboard. And then there was coronavirus. And then there was George Floyd. And now we're getting back to more what I had always thought of all the time as standard definitions. That worked for us. It worked for us. Objectivity worked for us. And then it stopped. And now maybe we're getting back to an idea of truth-telling that works for us. It works for the consumers more than whatever the old thing was.
And having experienced that massive blip in the middle, that doesn't concern you, that seeming that the appearance of things going back to normal could be illusory or temporary?
Oh, well, I think we are now recognizing that we've learned the lesson. There is the raging through the institutions trying to root out anything with the letters D, E, or I in them is not a good idea. IDEA. Right? But I think that we went through something that was pretty scarring, and there's not a critical mass who can will that back. I don't know. Maybe you want to say, and also Elon controls Twitter now. Maybe that's some huge part of it that I'm not giving enough credence to. But yeah, we went through a cultural spasm that was a mistake. Very frustrating that the people who were part of the spasm don't even recognize it, aren't admitting it, think that, oh, that wasn't me. But they, of course, went along. But that's where we are now. No, I'm not terribly worried we're going to go back. Things change. Things are faster than ever. We're just this fast twitch society, much more. Everything's been sped up. This is the Filer faster theorem. And that's where I think we are now. So some new weird thing's going to come down the pike, a thing I didn't anticipate, a thing that maybe my kids are watching, something about maybe it's black-pilled, maybe it's something out of the manosphere, maybe it's, I don't know, doing ice baths and putting tape on your mouth every morning, but something weird is going to happen. I just don't think it'll be the last weird thing. And I don't think it'll be so all-encompassing like the Great Awakening was.
Yeah, the great consulship of Andrew Tate.
Yeah.
Yes, Princeps Andrew Tate. My last question to you, that's kind of our canned question on certain things, but I'm genuinely curious about your answer. What do you think is the blind spots for the left and the right separately?
Yeah, I think that, I don't know how blind the left is to it, but I just think that...
Intentional blindness counts.
Yeah. I think they underestimate the value of safety. I think they play games with how safe people want to be, and people define safety as economic safety, which maybe they have a good conception of. Certainly physical safety, and safety is pretty much the number one concern. And if the public doesn't trust you to keep them safe, they're not going to trust you on anything. The right's ideological blind spots, people do want, they're not, the right as currently constituted is not sufficiently pluralistic. And they do not understand that not everyone has the same. I've read all the Jonathan Haidt, and I think the right and left have different values. And I think the left for many years were pretty horrible about, or the real left, not the, massive standard Democrat. I don't know if it's standard, but, some Michael Bennett Democrat would understand this. Maybe the far left wouldn't, but the right is just so punishing of people who define things like justice and fairness differently than they do. It's maybe not all on the right. I mean, Adam Kinzinger doesn't. I think he still calls himself on the right. You just got to be able to live with people of differing values. It's probably true for both of them, but I'm worried about that a lot on the right, how punishing they are. And man, owning the libs, it's a fun game, but it's no way to live one's life.
Mike Pesca, you can find him. You should find him on The Gist or on, what was it? Pesca's Peculations? Pesca's preponderance of Pesca's.
Peccadillos.
Pesca's propinquities.
Perturbances. I love propinquities. Yeah, it's Pesca profundities.
Pesca's profundities. I like a preponderance of Pescas.
Yes, that's the collective noun. It's the murder of crows and the preponderance of Pescas.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. We are uncertain.substack.com, and you can support us in whatever way you see fit. And at minimum, go check out Mike Pesca if you haven't already. Shame on you. Stay sane.